Hello human. Do not be afraid. I am merely here to ask you a question. Is it just me? Or do older games seem better than newer games? Try to guess which video game franchise I'm talking about. It is a franchise that released its first installment in the late 90s early 2000s. It received critical acclaim and garnered a dedicated fan base. They kept releasing awesome installments, banger after banger, until it practically became a household name amongst gamers. It seemed like this franchise couldn't fail. Then suddenly comes a fall. Perhaps the game is bought by a new company, or is under new leadership, or is owned by the same company but has had a change in design philosophy. At any rate, the franchise goes off in a new direction, abandoning what made the games that came before so great. Fans of those older games dislike the new direction and voice their criticism of the newer games to no avail. The developers keep straying further and further away from what made the old games great in the first place. What's worse is that some of the newer fans actually like the new direction and praise the current developers, causing a rift in the fan base. The newer fans accuse the older fans of being blinded by nostalgia, and not having good taste. The older fans get annoyed. And what ensues is a series of arguments and debates raging across the internet. The older fans insist the franchise has fallen from grace and must return to its roots. New fans assert that the franchise needs to evolve and that an older style of game wouldn't work in today's market. Now both sides are anxious as to which side of the fan base will get alienated. Both can't have what they want. So, did you guess the franchise? If your guess was half of every freaking franchise in the industry, then you are correct. But why does this trend keep occurring? And are the older games really better? Or are we really blinded by nostalgia, as they say? This will be the question of this video. We will discuss how games lose their way, what that does to the fan base of these games, and even talk about the hidden secret of what makes a great video game. The secret that explains why it seems for many of us that older games are better than newer games. And together we can bring things back to the way it was. No longer will we allow people to try to make Dark Souls have an easy mode, to put sprint in Halo, to make Assassin's Creed an RPG with zero stealth. My name is the Cultured Contrarian, and I say it's time we protect the games we love.
So what shall it be? Do you join the Unity, or do you die here?
First we have to discuss the two different philosophies adopted by the old and new video game developers. Back when video games were just starting to become a thing, it was the Wild West. Anything goes. There were no trends to follow, only trends to set. The only way to make it in this industry was to do something that had never been done before. Because nothing had been done before. After all the early video games made it big, any new developers on the scene would inevitably look back to old games for inspiration. There is nothing wrong with this in and of itself. But as developers stopped being video game developers who happen to make money, they became money makers who happen to make games. The profits took priority. And any semblance of originality began to slowly fade. And so modern game developers tend to either recreate the experience of the old games but only in superficial ways, or make games that abandon entirely what made them special and copy other similar games in the same genre. They either poorly imitate their past selves or copy their rivals and sell out the identity of the franchise. This is not to say that video game developers are lazy. Far from it. I am simply saying that they are putting their creative energy in the wrong places. Not because they are idiots, but because they are basically told to by their shareholders or managers or whatever. It's not a question of working harder, but working smarter, or at least being given the room to do so. Developers just need to be trusted to do what they do. The problem is a failing of leadership and bending to shareholders' concerns. Once shareholders are in the picture, it's basically the company's job to make them happy and feel safe about their investments. Shareholders aren't bad people, but they aren't exactly interested in creative integrity. They want to know how the business is going to grow its profits next quarter. This gets video game companies thinking in terms of graphs and pie charts, not creativity. They want to make a game that's marketable, not necessarily a game that's fun or actually any good. As long as it has the aesthetic of fun, it doesn't need to have any substance behind it. This is especially a problem when it comes to a concept in video game design that I call the core identity. The core identity in video games is the part of video games that you are left with if you were to remove all the non-essential aspects of the game. It is the utterly unique core experience the game has to offer. It is often referred to as the minimum viable product, but it is more complicated than that. It's what the game quote-unquote is. The core identity is not exactly talked about in game reviews or marketed in trailers. That is reserved for what I call Secondary aspects of a game. Secondary aspects are like the graphics, or the mechanics that are non-essential. The core identity of any art piece, and make no mistake, video games are art, is often subliminal or hidden beneath the surface. Many times, people won't even be able to say what the core identity is but will still be able to recognize it when it's not there. It can be sometimes described as a certain feeling you get. Let's use Halo as an example. For those of you that play Halo, what is Halo to you? You may not be able to describe it but you do know the feeling. That Halo feeling is so strong that when people watched the Halo Infinite trailer for the first time, they were able to tell it was Halo before it was even revealed.
Okay, so this is a game engine demonstration. Alright. Halo? Please? Please? I want Halo so bad. Are there deers in the Halo universe? What is this? I like the music. I like the music that's playing. What are you? Oh! Oh! I was right! It's Halo! Oh my god!
That is the power of a strong core identity. It simply resonates with you. The bizarre thing about video games is that they actually have two core identities at the same time. Like two beating hearts. There's the mechanical core identity, which is how the game feels when you play it at its most basic level. The basic set of mechanics that permeate the entire video game experience. And then there is the emotional core. It's comprised of the main narrative theme or the overall emotional experience the game gives you as you play. It's the loss of a once great civilization, as in BioShock, the loss of a once great civilization, as in Dark Souls, and of course, who could forget the feeling of the loss of a once great civilization as in Fallout. I especially like that last one. It was that indescribable feeling I mentioned before with Halo. I am going to try to describe it now. It's the feeling of the loss of a once great civilization. Oh god damn it. In all seriousness, the closest I could come to describing Halo's emotional core is the feeling of awe and wonder that comes with being an unfathomably small yet significant part of a story that is much bigger than you. It is practically a religious experience. Ever wonder why Halo uses so much religious iconography? It ties in well with its core experience. When a video game has good cohesion with its core experience and it just clicks, it can be an absolutely magical experience. When it comes to the mechanical core of Halo, Bungie went ahead and spelled it out for us. The Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle is often talked about in the Halo community as the core of what Halo is. It is guns, grenades and melee. But what most people get wrong about the Golden Triangle is not that the game has these three mechanics, but that the triangle is equilateral. That is to say that guns are balanced to be as important as grenades are as important as melee. You are doing all three at once. You are shooting as much as you are throwing grenades and as much as you are meleeing. What you get from that is gameplay like this.
Double kill.
This is what Halo is. Everything else about the game, from the famous 30 seconds of fun to the weaponry to the enemy AI and level design. All are built on the Golden Triangle. And if you're a Halo fan, you know what comes next. When 343 took over the IP for Halo, the Golden Triangle was defaced and the feel of the gameplay completely changed. To the uninitiated the game would have looked very similar. But the game now has sprint, which changes how the Golden Triangle operates. Guns are now more laser-focused due to the increased movement speed and grenades are easier to avoid. Double melee becomes a thing which makes melee way too OP, making the Golden Triangle less equilateral and more scaling. And from then on, the part of Halo community which liked the older games, to put it lightly, disliked sprint. However, the newer fans actually like sprint. And what ensues is a series of debates raging across the internet. You get the point. The fan base is now divided by the virgin sprint lovers and the Chad Classic Halo fans. If you think sprint belongs in Halo, then you are a total poopy head.
Hang on a minute, there is nothing wrong with sprint in Halo.
What? Who is that?
I am the voice of reason. And I say it's perfectly valid if you enjoy sprint in Halo. Not to mention you were wrong about when sprint was added. It was added in Halo Reach, which was made by Bungie. Not 343. Looks like Bungie didn't care about your precious core identity. Besides, who cares if it doesn't fit with the core identity? Games need to innovate.
You hear this argument from sprint fans all the time. Notice he used the word innovate? That's a corporate buzzword. For some reason sprint fans are thinking like the corporate execs. Not whether or not sprint belongs in Halo, but whether it can get with the times and be hip with the kids these days.
How do you do, fellow kids?
They think about Halo in terms of marketing, not fun. And that is exactly what is wrong in the video game industry.
Don't try and strawman me, old man. I'm just trying to say that game developers shouldn't try to just push the same old stuff over and over with no change. Like FIFA or 2K. Those are games that certainly stick to their core identity. Because it's a meme at this point how they never change. So sticking to the core identity isn't important. Being new and creative is important. The core aspects of the old games you like were good when they were new. Now they have gotten stale. Things need to change. Sure, some developers have slipped up when going in a new direction, but that is all part of learning. It doesn't mean we should avoid changing or growing. I'm not appealing to marketing or whatever, I'm just suggesting that the fans are given what they want.
Now you're the one who's strawmanning. I want games to innovate too. But I want them to innovate in the secondary aspects of the game while keeping the integrity of the core concept. I agree that the core identity alone can't save a game, but neither can innovation. Just look at Cyberpunk 2077. It tried to be an open-world shooter RPG crime sandbox choose-your-own narrative roguelike puzzle platformer that is just like Dark Souls. The only thing it is missing is the feeling of the loss of a once great Civil. Oh great, it even kinda has that. My point is, did Cyberpunk succeed at even one thing it tried? Not really. Every time a video game fails to focus on its core identity or what makes it special, it fails as a game. And when the game has no core identity to begin with, then... well...
Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
Speaking of rigged from the start, what about Fallout New Vegas? You keep griping about how video games these days don't know how to stick to their core identity like some pretentious soy boy. But Fallout New Vegas has a completely different core identity from Fallout 1 and even Fallout 3. In fact, Fallout New Vegas is the least Fallout of all the Fallouts. I mean, Fallout 1 is basically a glorified point-and-click adventure game with a branching narrative and RNG thrown in for good measure. Fallout 3's core narrative experience is about the oppression of a nuclear wasteland. It is a warning of what could happen if humanity nuked itself. From the crushing isolation you feel to the fact that everything you eat and drink is constantly irradiated, Fallout 3 has much more of an oppressive atmosphere than Fallout New Vegas, which would be more in line with what you would call the core identity. But look what happens when you depart from the core identity, you get Fallout New Vegas. You could be forgiven if while playing the game you forgot you were in a nuclear wasteland, most of the water isn't even irradiated, and yet most people say Fallout New Vegas is the best Fallout in the series. That seems to poke holes in your core identity theory. I guess innovation isn't just a corporate buzzword, huh?
First of all, Vegas isn't exactly a new game, is it? Which proves my point. And second of all, Fallout New Vegas is the least Fallout in Fallout? I guess you never heard of Fallout 76. The most recent Fallout. Which sucked. Also, you better take back what you said about Fallout 1, you little brat. The core of what made that game special was its narrative. That and the fact that I was in it. Fallout 3 completely messed up the narrative, whereas Fallout New Vegas got it right. While you could say the atmosphere is a departure, Fallout New Vegas still got its core identity right better than Fallout 3. So ha. And Fallout 76 still proves my point that greed and a lack of vision are what motivate the development of current video games in the market. It would be too easy to chalk the failing of modern video games up to microtransactions and unfinished releases. Even if they hadn't messed that stuff up, which they have, then old games would still have more of a clear creative vision than modern games. Microtransactions are just a symptom of that larger problem. That companies are making games for the sake of it and not out of passion.
Okay, boomer. The fact is that you can do more in modern video games than you could ever dream of in older ones. Newer technology has given way to more than just better graphics, it's allowed for people in video games to have more agency and to do more stuff. Even you can't deny that. As much as you are a nostalgia-blind senile old man.
Are you familiar with what an ad hominem is? Because that's what you just did. That's what the nostalgia argument is. But now that you mention it, agency is a great segue into my next point. And why more agency isn't necessarily a good thing. You know what is a good thing? Hitting the subscribe button. Come on already, make with the liking and the subscribing. Hey kid, let's play a game really quick, you and me.
What? Okay, fine. What's the game called?
It's called the Game of God. It's a game limited only by imagination. It's a game where we take turns summoning things.
What? Like with magic?
Not in real life, idiot. Basically, you say something you're gonna summon, and I say something that beats it, and we go back and forth.
Okay, I'll start I guess. I summon a gun.
Then I summon a bulletproof vest.
Then I summon a bazooka.
Then I summon a bazooka-proof vest.
Then I summon a black hole.
Then I summon God. There, I win.
Wait, what?
I summon God. Nothing beats God. Therefore, I win.
What? That game was stupid. You could have just summoned God from the beginning, and it would have been over. It wasn't very fun.
Exactly. It's not supposed to be. It's a game that's meant to illustrate how a lack of limitations is boring as heck. Some smarty pants somewhere once said that video games are a series of interesting decisions. But what is interesting is that this smarty pants never mentioned anything about how having more agency means having more fun. That's because it doesn't matter if you can do a million different things in a video game if only 5 of those million things are interesting. It's more than just the classic quality over quantity argument. It's about how in video games, as in life, it's not what you can do that makes things interesting, it's what you can't do. There's a fantasy author called Brandon Sanderson who came up with the Brandon Sanderson rules for Magic systems. I know this has to do with writing stories, but I believe the principles are transferable to video games as well. One of the rules states that the limitations of a magical power will always be more interesting than the actual powers themselves because that is where the tension is derived from. I believe it is for a similar reason that video games with harsh and oppressive environments are often beloved and cherished by those that stick with them. This is why games like Pathological and Dark Souls are better than games like Skyrim, for example. What's that famous line from Todd Howard?
That mountain is not just a backdrop. You can walk all the way to the top of that mountain.
That's all well and good that you can, but if there is no reason to do it or not to do it, then why does the increased agency matter? In Skyrim, you have 18 skills to level up, 10 different races and God knows how many different weapons. But all that agency is meaningless if the only viable or fun build is a stealth archer. Not to mention you are usually the most powerful person in the game who can go anywhere they wanted when they wanted. In Dark Souls, you're much more limited in what you can do. In Skyrim you can flip a big middle finger to the main quest and do whatever, but in Dark Souls you have to confront a grueling, often almost unpleasant challenge or do basically nothing else. You either beat the challenge or you don't. The amount of spells you can use in any given run is limited. The level design is limited. You are limited. And that's the point of Dark Souls. Both games offer you a fair amount of choice, but Dark Souls limits it much more than Skyrim. Dark Souls has less choices to make at any given moment, but the choices you do make in Dark Souls feel like life and death. I don't want a game where I can do anything. I want a game where I can do something, even if it's one thing and it is a challenge to do. Older games were limited by their nature and forced to only allow for the player to make a few decisions at any given time, but they felt like they were important. Modern video games tend to buy into the worst of either extreme when it comes to agency. They either make the game on rails or make it so that the only decisions being made is how fast you mash the X button in a QuickTime event. Or they try to give you the ability to go anywhere and do anything with no thought given as to what difficult decisions the player is being forced to make. Choices only matter if there are interesting consequences to those choices, but despite the technology, it is not the consequences of your choices that is explored in video games but the variety of the types of choices you can make. And all this talk about agency is actually relevant to that secret I mentioned near the start of the video. It's time for me to reveal what that is. The secret to what makes a great video game and why older video games are better. That secret is doing more with less. What do I mean by doing more with less? It is about getting the most fun out of the simplest aspects of a game and applying those aspects to as many different situations as possible. Whether it is simple mechanics or simple choices in narrative or art design. It is about taking a small idea or concept and running with it as much as possible. It is not quite the same thing as saying less is more, because you can make a big game on the concept of doing more with less. If you combine the principles of sticking to a core identity when making a game with the idea that limitations are more fun than a lack of limitations, then you get the idea of doing more with less. Saying doing more with less is the ultimate secret sounds like a cop-out and really obvious, but let's take a look at what this actually looks like. Take Mario as an example. Mario is a game that is built around you doing basically one thing. Jumping. That is basically 90% of what you are doing in that game. And yet it managed to be fun. Why? Did it need to have an in-depth character customizer screen where you decide what genital presets you choose and what tragic backstory you come from? Did it need to have hyper-complex RPG mechanics with an in-game economy and complex narrative on the meaning of life? No. You only need to jump. Instead of having thousands of different mechanics, one mechanic does most of the heavy lifting. Mario takes the mechanic of jumping and tries to build as many challenges off of that simple idea as possible. They took one mechanic and got as much depth out of it as they could. They allowed you to jump at different heights depending on how long you held the button down and created a skill gap. The enemies were defeated by jumping. As more games came out, they expanded what they could do with jumping. Even the jumping animations and the way Mario goes when he jumps. In most other games, that sort of detail couldn't be less important, but in Mario it's important because it is doing more with the concept of jumping by adding to it. If you are able to take a simple idea and apply it to an entire game, then you have a great game on your hands. That simple idea is what ends up being the core identity of a game. Remember the 30 seconds of fun that Bungie pioneered? It was basically the principle I'm talking about. If you can play a game that is fun when playing it for 30 seconds and apply that fun out to an entire game, you have a fun game. Look at every game that is successful in history. Minecraft, it's basically just Lego in video game form. You place blocks and build stuff. That applied to an entire game is fun. Why is it that Outer Wilds is more fun than No Man's Sky? In No Man's Sky you can explore a to-scale universe filled with near-infinite content. Outer Wilds allow you to explore one solar system. And yet they took that one solar system and made it feel deeper and more memorable than anything No Man's Sky has to offer. Less content and yet more fun. It is usually the simplest ideas that have the easiest time getting players to engage with the game. Let's look at Among Us for example. Among Us is extraordinarily simple at its core. Notice how not a lot of time was spent fleshing out the mini-games you play in the game? That is because the game is focusing on getting the most it can out of the social deduction aspect of the game, which you don't need to write much code to make fun. You get a lot of emotional engagement with not much work put in compared to most AAA games. What about Pac-Man? The only mechanics in that game are move up, down, left and right. Eat the dots and avoid the ghosts until you can eat them. But the game gets so much tension out of trying to avoid the ghosts that the ratio of emotional engagement to the amount of code put into the game is astronomical. The benefit to this approach to game design is that the game is more focused. It has a core identity that is easy to connect to, meaning a dedicated fanbase can form around it easier. Too many different ideas and the game becomes an unfocused mess. You'll hear critics saying things like, "I don't know what this game is trying to be." Games have to specialize at something. It's more economic. Games can't do everything no matter how hard they try. There will always be limited time and money. So it makes sense that if you take a handful of simple mechanics and apply them to the full extent, you would have an easier time developing the game, as it is merely the same mechanic remixed in different situations. Doing more with less is about getting the most impact out of the littlest amount of work possible, so it is an appealing way for developers to make a game. If you have a massive idea for a game, then the minimum viable product will still be quite demanding, but if you do more with less, you can take a simple concept and apply it out to as much as you want. The game is more accessible. If you build the game off of a simple foundation that is used consistently, people will have an easier time picking up the game and getting used to what it is trying to be. Doing more with less will make you focus on the aspects of your game that are most important and carve out an identity for itself. An older video game, due to their lack of resources and opportunity to fail, were forced to take advantage of the principle of deriving the most amount of fun out of the fewest and simplest mechanics possible. The only reason that game companies don't do that now is twofold. One is because the companies that do employ the strategy of doing more with less usually do so by accident. The other reason is because of the marketing thing I mentioned before. What aspect of a game is marketable? The graphics, the framerate, how expansive your open world is, and let's face it, if it is a game released after 2018, then it is by default open world. All of this stuff is marketable. Because of the normals. All of those types of people who just buy games without even thinking about it. The kind of people who keep buying Call of Duty games and play battle royals, and if the game you like that's much older isn't exactly like those games, then they don't have time for it. The kind of people who buy a game and have to convince themselves they are having fun because their favorite Twitch streamer plays it. And that's why we have to keep these normals out of our communities. Otherwise, we will keep having these divides in the fan bases around whether the older games were better or if the newer games were better. If we keep the fan base of a game pure, then developers will have no choice but to cater to the tastes of what their core most loyal fans want. And we can finally bring things back to the way it was. Bring back the golden age of gaming where everything was better. You're awfully quiet, kid. It's usually at this point you would call me a boomer or something. Got anything to say?
It's funny. I actually agreed with you for a second there.
What? Really?
Well, I think the part where you unironically called for people to bully and gatekeep entire communities into submission was reprehensible. But that part about the whole, doing more with less thing. At first I thought it was just more of the kind of self-congratulatory fart-sniffing I'd expect from you. I half expected you to go on a rant about liminal space or ludonarrative dissonance or something.
But you agree doing more with less is what developers should be doing, right? And that's why older games are better, because they did that more often. It was because back then the communities were united. We all knew what we wanted and we wanted the same things. It made it so that the games could be more focused and have their own identity.
As long as there are differences, we will tear ourselves apart fighting each other.
No more dissenting opinions. No more casual fans. One fan base. One mind. A true unity. Gatekeeping is the only way to bring the glory days back, don't you see?
It's not a hive mind community that makes games good. New games can still apply the principle of doing more with less. What about small indie games?
What about them?
Well, so many modern indie games are narrow in their focus and build their games around simple mechanics. They do just about everything you said in this video. Look at Hollow Knight. It has incredibly simple mechanics and it is a newer game that did really well. Indie games are paving the way in creativity and artistic focus. And they do it without anyone having to gatekeep the community. Or what about Halo Infinite? You were complaining about it before, but 343 has completely solved the sprint problem. Even classic fans are tolerating it now. It's a non-issue. Halo Infinite is proof that gatekeeping isn't needed to get a franchise back on track. So you see, you are only sowing needless division.
But it cannot be. This would mean that
all my work
has been for nothing. Everything that I've tried to a failure. It can't be. I don't think that I can continue to have done the things I have done in the name of progress and healing. It was madness. I can see that now. Madness. There is no hope. Leave now. Leave while you still have
hope.